This one is super frustrating for me. So Spotify just paid Joe Rogan $100 million for an exclusive deal for his podcast. What this means is the Joe Rogan Experience will only be available on Spotify with some YouTube clips of bits and pieces of the podcast still being on YouTube. But it's getting pulled off YouTube, it's getting pulled off Apple Podcasts, it's getting pulled everywhere, and you will only be able to consume this podcast from Spotify. And this payout happened while Spotify currently pays some of the lowest rates for streaming for artists, for your music. And Spotify is actually, literally, legally trying to overturn legislation that gave you, the songwriter, a raise. So let's unpack this and let's figure out what this actually means for your music career. Thanks so much for stopping by for another video. I'm Colt Capperrune. Unfortunately, I'm not in that great of a mood today. But regardless of that, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon next to the subscribe tab. Give me a thumbs up and drop a comment. This one's gonna be important. I think this is something that people in the music industry need to pay attention to. And if you want a career in the music industry, you have to understand how these things work. Now, first, let me say that I am an avid Joe Rogan Experience listener. I'm a huge fan of his podcast. I listen to just about every single episode. I've also been warning people about where Spotify is headed for literally years now. I've been preaching about how we can't let Spotify get too strong. We can't let them become a monopoly. Now, I understand why Rogan moved away from YouTube to Spotify because YouTube is becoming increasingly difficult to work with. Censorship, demonetization, pulling videos down. There's certainly not a true, literal freedom of speech happening on YouTube, regardless of whether or not you agree with their actions. So I understand why he did this. And also, I don't blame him. It's not Joe Rogan's job to protect the music industry. The man built an empire and he just got paid for building that empire. Good for him. I don't blame him at all. So not only are Spotify payouts some of the lowest of any streaming platform in the music industry, they also are actually literally repealing the Music Modernization Act, which is the first raise that songwriters have gotten in like 100 years. Now, while I've been preaching this for quite some time, the argument from artists and from songwriters has always been like, well, it's the biggest platform. I have to put my music on Spotify. It's the biggest platform. It's where I get the most streams. And my answer to that for years now has been, if we keep doubling down and pushing Spotify into a position of power, into a monopoly, there might become a day, probably will become a day, when they are too powerful and they will literally control the music industry. Now, on principle, I just think that's a terrible idea for any one single entity to have that much power over an entire industry. Spotify has spent $700 million in the past 18 months acquiring podcasts alone. Yet they still pay artists some of the lowest streaming rates of any streaming service. And they're literally trying to overturn legislation that gave you a raise. What this means is Spotify is telling artists they don't care about their music. They don't care about you as an artist. Spotify has yet to report a profit for any single year that they've been operational. Yet they can spend $700 million on podcasts, yet pay you some of the lowest rates in the industry and actively fight against legislation to pay you more money. Unfortunately, the bigger Spotify grows, the more power they have, the more they can do whatever they want, the more they can pay you whatever they want. And what I have feared for years is continuing to become more and more true right in front of our eyes. I just wanted artists and bands to stick up for themselves. It's bad business to do business with people that are trying to screw you. And so on principle alone, it's bad business to do business with Spotify if you're an artist or a musician or a songwriter. With every acquisition like the Joe Rogan Experience, Spotify becomes one step closer to being a monopoly in all things media. And at this point, it would take a massive number of artists to leave Spotify in order to slow this momentum down in any way. So what does this actually mean for your music career? Where do we actually go from here? How do we course correct this? How do we change this situation? Now let me read you some stats here as far as number of users that these platforms have. And this is going to help you understand exactly where you should go from here. Spotify currently has 271 million users with 124 million paid subscribers. Apple Music has 60 million subscribers. Amazon Music has 55 million subscribers. YouTube Music has 1 billion music users. Pandora, 63.5 million users. SoundCloud, 175 million users. Now, if you add up all these other platforms, excluding Spotify only, you come up with 1,353,500,000 users. So if you pit Spotify against all the rest of the streaming platforms combined, it dwarfs Spotify. So this argument that you have to put your music on Spotify in order to reach people is kind of irrelevant to me. You can reach 1.3 billion people by just using the other platforms excluding Spotify. That's compared to Spotify's 271 million. So we are talking 5 times more people on all the other platforms combined. So I think what's important now is to diversify your income streams. Capitalize on all the other streaming services, all of them. Unfortunately, Spotify is now too big to ignore. It's what I've been trying to avoid this whole time. But that doesn't mean that you have to put all your eggs in the Spotify basket. It doesn't mean that the only platform that you share and post on Facebook and Instagram is your Spotify. Arguably, you can reach way more people with the rest of the platforms combined than you can on Spotify anyway. So leave your music on Spotify if you choose to do so. Just don't let it be the only platform you promote, because the bigger they get, the more they will be able to do anything they want. They'll be able to pay you anything they want. This whole thing frustrates me because I'm such an avid listener of the Joe Rogan Experience. Do I take back everything that I've said about Spotify for the past 5 or 6 years just so I can keep listening to my favorite podcast? Do I succumb to the power of Spotify and throw in the towel on the good fight just so I can keep listening to my favorite podcast? I firmly believe that it's bad business to do business with people who are trying to screw you. If you had a partner in your business and that partner was constantly stealing cash out of the cash register, would you continue to do business with them? Hell no. Remember to plan for the future. Remember to continually work towards setting yourself up and doing everything you can within the industry to prepare for your future. Yes, I know you want to be in front of the most amount of fans right now. And yes, that's important, but it's also important that there's still an industry that exists for you to actually have a career. And you might say, oh, nobody makes that much money off of streaming anyway. Well, that doesn't mean you throw in the towel. The Music Modernization Act was the first step in a positive direction of getting a raise for singers and songwriters in the past 100 years. So things have the potential to move in the right direction, but we have to fight for it because it's not going to go that way on its own. Thank you guys for watching. I really hope you got something out of this. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon next to the subscribe tab. Share with your friends if you think someone else could get something from this. This is something that needs to be talked about. We'll see you guys in the next one.